Somme, France, July 1st, 1916. The bloodiest battle in British history begins.
Stop talking! Stop talking! Poor man! Poor...
So, would you like to tell us about how the Germans were equipped to go into battle?
We were all battle veterans, so we had the proper equipment, proper training. We were prepared, and more important than the equipment, we had trained operators. So with the British, they had no idea what they were doing because they were fresh out of the academy. Our had operators who had been in battle before, so we knew exactly what we were doing, and I think that's mostly what gave us the edge.
Very good. Would you say that the Germans were trained very well to go into battle?
We were trained very well. We were all battle tested. We had been in battle before.
Very good. Would you say that the German trenches were very riddled with disease?
There was disease. There certainly was disease. Trench foot, gangrene, trench fever, and there's lice, there's puddles. Trenches are no summer camp, but we dealt with it. We did what we had to do.
Okay. How would you say the latrines built into the trenches were?
Latrines were rudimentary at best. There are pots or holes or just an out of the way section of the trench. They're not pretty, but luckily, since our trenches were more sheltered, the latrines stayed intact, like some of the British trenches, which got washed away by water and fighting.
I've learned that the Germans, during the Battle of the Somme, used chlorine and or mustard gas to weaken the British ranks. Is this true?
It is true. Since many of the British soldiers didn't know how to use the gas mask, we used mustard gas or chlorine gas, and we would put them in artillery, put them in the shells, and launch them into the trenches. And since they were denser than air, they would sink down into the trenches and stay in the trenches. And the men who had no gas masks or didn't know how to use them properly, their lungs would burn from the inside out. And it's rather gruesome, but it shortened the war.
Can I hear your opinion on the weather that happened in the area of the battle?
It was awful. Rainy and nasty, and the puddles, and then the puddles get your shoes wet and your socks wet, and then your feet are constantly damp, and they make you susceptible to diseases. They're despicable, and it just hurts morale, and not fun.
Did the Germans employ any gas masks for any potential raids during mustard gas-filled trenches?
Yes, we had gas masks. We were properly trained with them. We had them. Many of our soldiers had to shave, so the gas mask would seal on their face properly. Many Germans had full beards that they had to shave to just have a mustache or a small bit of hair under the nose.
And lastly, what is your opinion on No Man's Land? Just any stories or things you can tell.
Well, No Man's Land, it's what it sounds like. It's filled with barbed wire. There are many craters and big puddles from the shelling, specifically the British shelling, because they were terrible. They couldn't hit anything, so a lot of the shells went into No Man's Land, and just barbed wire everywhere. Just horrid, and the bodies they piled up because the British would run to the trenches, and we would shoot them with our machine guns and mow them down, and we'd hit them with the shells, and it was awful.
Thank you. And I think that's all. So, in World War I heard the Germans had used tanks during the war. What was your experience with any of the tank warfare?
I myself have not been in a tank, but
On our way to the front lines, we did see several of them. They're like big metal boxes on tracks, like caterpillar tracks. They go over about anything, and they're armored, so they could not be shot. The only thing that would destroy them were the shells, but they could storm up to the enemy trench, and then they could, shoot into the trenches or use machine guns mounted on them to shoot into the trenches, and they were a very effective way of storming the trenches.
You say they're very effective, but weren't they very liable to break down even before reaching the battlefield?
That is true. They were mass constructed, and when they broke, they got stuck, and people were stuck inside them, and they didn't often make it to where they were going, but when they did, they were very effective.
Very good. And since trench warfare is a staple of World War I, how was it that trenches were constructed?
So we would have the trench, and they would zigzag back and forth so that concussive blasts from the shells would not travel so far in the trenches, and it was harder for people to raid the trenches. And we would put sandbags on top of the trenches, and we would have a shooting platform, a raised platform, and people would stand on that to shoot, and people would sleep there. But it was a dirt trench with sandbags at the top. And that was basically it.
Thank you. That'll be it.
Hello, everyone. I'm here today with two World War I vets from the Battle of the Somme. Can you please introduce yourselves and where you're from?
I'm Jeremy Clarkson from Greenwich.
And I'm Richard Heyman from London, England.
How did you two first meet?
Well, we first met in the registrations office signing up for the war. We ironically were two young men wanting to sign up to serve for our country. And so when we were deployed, we found out we were in the same fleet. And it was ever since then.
Pretty charming.
Yeah.
So, you two were both in the trenches. Can you describe a little bit of that for me?
The trenches were horrendous. It was water-filled, rat-filled, disease-ridden. Things like trench foot and trench fever riddled between all the soldiers.
He actually caught trench fever once.
I did.
He was sidelined for a couple of days.
Trench fever, can you explain a little bit about that to me?
Trench fever is a parasitic infection caused by a certain type of body lice that it's not fun. Leaves you with fever. It can give you some bacteremia, which is blood found in the or bacteria found in the bloodstream. It gives you extreme migraines, fevers, a lot of nasty symptoms that you honestly wouldn't enjoy. And while I was sidelined, all that kept me alive, or well, kicking and sensible, was a lot of morphine, painkillers.
So, are you still addicted to those drugs?
Not at all. I made sure to keep myself in moderation, as I would only take it when I was really feeling pain and when I couldn't bear it any longer. So I was lucky not to get addicted to it.
I am led to believe that you didn't receive very much training. You were thrown right into service.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. We were in the same basic, which was pretty nice, but it was about a week and a half, and it was just basic how to shoot a gun, how to dig a trench, and then we were off on our way.
What kind of rations and food did they serve you?
The rations were very, very minimalistic. It was mostly a protein, like a bean, or a vegetable stew that may have had some meat in it, like a beef, and then you had a starch or a bread, like it was often cornbread or a loaf or any other type of starch substance that was served.
So those bad conditions in the trenches and the poor rations, that must have made you more susceptible to diseases like trench fever and trench foot, am I correct?
Yeah, it was very widespread. Many diseases they'd often go from person to person. Entire trench would get it. It was just awful.
What kind of equipment were you given?
This was actually the first battle where we all had steel helmets, but just simple, basic machinery, machine guns, and occasionally we'd get a grenade.
And you had large artillery. You were trying to shell the Germans, am I correct?
Yes, we often spent a week prior to the battle, before the battle started, we shelled them for a week, and it was what we thought was pretty good, but our artillerymen were not obviously they were inexperienced, so they missed a lot of their shots, and turns out they did barely little to none. No damage to the barbed wire in the trenches and of the British, not British, German.
Now, what kind of defenses did you have from the German?
Our trenches were pretty shrewdly dug. They weren't very well equipped. We didn't think we were going to be that long, so we built them really quick. And of course, the Germans had already built theirs up on a hill, so we didn't have much time to build.
So, but in No Man's Land, what was that like?
No Man's Land is very barren. It's got, mostly water-filled craters of shells. It has a lot of barren trees that have lost all their foliage. And it's full of barbed wire, things that, people wouldn't cross. That it was nearly impossible to cross in general. Most of the time we stuck away from it, and unless it was in a charge.
That's why it was called No Man's Land. There were mines, barbed wire, and of course you had to deal with the German machine guns firing at you every time you tried to step across, so it was terrible.
So what happened to the wounded?
Most of the time, if they were too fatally wounded, unless it was something small like an arm or a leg wound, they were left to die on the field, and they weren't brought back by medics. But for basic arm wounds, most were treated with morphine and then stretchered back all the way to the trenches where they could be more surveyed by our on-trench medics.
Well, thank you two for your time today.